For the first time in 3 decades, the United States and Iran are on speaking terms. And joining us now to tell us what the dialogue between Tehran and Washington means for the two countries and for the region, in Washington, D.C., Genevieve Abdo. She is a fellow at Stimson Center's Middle East program and non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and we're glad to have you on the program from the American capital city. Genevieve, I wonder if we could start by having you just outline the deal that was agreed to between Iran and the so-called P5+1, Russia, China, England, France, the U.S., plus Germany. What was the basic outline of the deal?
Well, the basic outline of the deal was the objectives include trying to limit Iran's enrichment capabilities, trying to create a system of transparency and inspections, and also I think that the point, at least on the west side, the point was to also be able to monitor on a regular basis Iran's program in general, such as its Arak facility and some of its other facilities. So I think that transparency was an issue, and also particularly enrichment was an issue. And it's been quite interesting, actually, because enrichment has been such a controversial issue for both sides. The way that both President Obama and President Rouhani interpreted the agreement. So when President Rouhani went back to Tehran, he boasted that the agreement actually stated that Iran has a right to enrich. And in fact, the agreement does not state that. And so it was quite interesting to see how the President Rouhani spun this to try to gain public support for the process, which of course will continue. This is just a 6-month agreement, but the process will continue.
Well, let's see if we can understand and perhaps clarify what Iran can and can't do now as a result of the agreement. Can you be helpful on that?
Sure. Iran can't sort of hide its nuclear facilities. It has to enrich uranium at the percentages that are agreed upon. It was enriching 20% and threatened to enrich even beyond 20%. And the reason that that's important is that at some point in time, when you reach certain levels of uranium enrichment, that allows you to reach what's called breakout capability. In other words, the capability of building a bomb. So that's why it's very important for the West to keep these enrichment levels low, so that Iran is not able at some point in time. And people believe that even Iran was, if you believe the Israeli position, the Israelis believe that Iran was months, if not only a year away from building a bomb. So that's why the P5+1, as it's called, the countries you mentioned, wanted to cap Iran's enrichment, which Iran agreed to.
And just so I'm clear, the 20% doesn't get you, 20% enrichment won't get you nuclear weapons capability, but what, 75, 80% will get you there? What's the real number?
It's hard to say, and I'm not a nuclear scientist, so I can't say with any great certainty, but the point is, the higher the enrichment, the more potential there is for breakout capability.
Okay. Does this deal, in your view, indicate major concessions by either side, and if so, what?
No. What the Iranians wanted, of course, ultimately, is for the sanctions to be lifted. According to this deal, for example, they would like the oil embargo, which was imposed by the European Union, to be lifted. This agreement does not lift the oil embargo. So both sides tried to reach an interim agreement that basically allows for the hard and difficult issues to be talked about later. And this is, I think, a very important point, because people have been very optimistic about this deal, more because it has reopened the diplomatic process. So I think that a good way to sort of view this agreement is not that it is going to solve the problems that the West has with Iran's nuclear program. No. The greatest success of this agreement is that it ended more than 3 decades, as you mentioned, of no communication, no diplomatic process between Iran and the United States. And it has also created an atmosphere of diplomacy, not only between, for example, Secretary of State Kerry and the Foreign Minister of Iran, Mr. Zarif, but even between the two presidents. So, as we all know, a phone call was made by President Obama to President Rouhani. So I think that that's really the success of this agreement, is that it has reopened the bilateral relationship between Iran and the United States, because people have been very excited for good reasons, but the difficulties are coming later.
Let me see if there's some more good news in this, insofar as if there is, in fact, an upper limit beyond which Iran cannot go when it comes to uranium enrichment. Do we infer from that that Iran, in fact, has been truthful over the years when it says it has no nuclear weapons ambitions as part of its nuclear program?
That's really hard to determine, to be perfectly honest. There has always been these assertions by Iran's supreme leader, even more recently after the deal was agreed upon, that Iran has no ambitions to build a nuclear weapon. This is often repeated. But I think that if you think about Iran's strategic position, not only in the Middle East, but in general, to some degree, the recent sort of developments in the Middle East would encourage Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, you know, no country with a nuclear weapon, whether it's Pakistan or Israel, has ever been attacked. And Iran came very close to being attacked about a year ago. And so if you're looking at your security issues and your national security agenda from an Iranian perspective, why wouldn't you want to reach breakout capability? But that's not, I just want to emphasize, there's reason to be skeptical. That's not what the Iranians are saying, though, and that's not what they've said historically. What they've said historically is that they're not interested in developing a nuclear weapon, that their nuclear facilities are for isotopes, they're for medical purposes, and for other peaceful purposes. That's their official position.
Okay, you've already pointed out that the success, to the extent there is success, of this arrangement is that the two sides are talking again for the first time in 3 decades. But of course, there is this 6-month window where negotiations continue, and there's still, if you like, a finish line to get to. How hopeful are you that that finish line can, in fact, be got to now?
I think it's 50-50. We just don't know. It's really going to depend. It's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend, first of all, of the domestic political situation in both countries. As we have seen just this week, the U.S. Congress is threatening to pass more sanctions on Iran. Foreign Minister Zarif said in Time magazine, and he has said repeatedly over the last few months, that should that happen, the negotiations are over, that they will halt the negotiations. You have hardliners in Iran, similar to the hardliners in the United States, is criticizing the deal, saying that Iran gave up too much, that you can't trust the Americans. And I think it's been very interesting to listen to the speeches given by Supreme Leader Khamenei, because he has positioned himself in a very clever way. He has basically said, okay, I'm going forward with this deal. You can't trust the Americans. And he's giving himself room for maneuver later should something fall apart. Then he can return to what he said this month or last month and say, you see, I told you can't trust the Americans. So it's very tentative. It's a very tentative pause in the hostility between the United States and Iran. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of difficulties to get through, including the domestic political situations in both countries.
I do want to talk about those two countries and their relationship after 3 decades of basically saying nothing to each other. And to do so, we are happy to welcome in, straight from Waterloo, Besma Momani from the Center for International Governance Innovation. She's also a fellow at the Brookings Institution. And let's start, Besma, with that relationship. These two countries, Iran and the U.S., they haven't said anything pleasant to each other in 32 years, 33 years. They're talking now. What made that happen?
Well, I think the stars were aligned in many ways. I mean, having Rouhani come in and Ahmadinejad, who had really just upset pretty much everybody, out of the picture, there was an opportunity there to really see a moderate come into power, clearly a team behind him like Zarif and others, Khamenei, or I should say Khatami himself, endorsing this and really wanting, I think, to have these two parties meet was really important as well. This couldn't have happened without the blessing of the Supreme Leader. And then you had Obama, obviously, who has made very clear from the beginning of his presidency and his Nowruz message to the Iranian people that he really wants to see a change in relationship. So I think all of this culminated in just the perfect storm, and the stars were aligned that allowed this moment to happen. And I think it's actually a very good thing in the long term. Candidate
Obama, when he was going for the Democratic nomination, actually did say, I'm happy to pick up the phone rather than go to war, obviously, against Iran. So this actually has been consistent with his uttered statements, his public statements for the last 5 years, hasn't it been?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, even though we see a lot of, I think, opposition to it in the political capital in Washington, this does appeal to his base in the sense that the people who wanted him to come in are the ones that are fatigued from war, don't want to see an interventionist U.S. policy. So I think he does have support at home, although I think it's, mired in a whole bunch of domestic issues, whether it's Obamacare and other things going on. But the reality is, this does appeal to his not necessarily pacifist stream of the Democrat Party, but people who don't want to see military being used as the first resort, but rather the last resort. In fact, diplomacy indeed being the first opportunity or the first mechanism in order to communicate with these partners.
One more follow-up, and that is these two countries, obviously since the hostage-taking in 1979, have been on about as bad terms as you can be without going to war, and there has been a ton of mutual distrust that has built up ever since. How much of the distrust do you think was taken down as a result of these successful negotiations so far?
Well, I do want to be, being somewhat politically correct, and the history has to be really important here because, in fact, this goes back even further. It's back to 1953 when the CIA went in and actually overthrew, a democratically elected government, Mossadegh. So it actually has a deeper history than that. But yes, I think that, look, at the end of the day, when we first look at Obama and Rouhani first talking, that 15 minutes, everybody had a lot of optimism about that phone call. It's not enough to change just by having the virtue of this Geneva or this interim agreement to really be the new, I think, embrace of Iran. This is no by any means a rapprochement, but it is, I think, a softening of the kinds of tone and rhetoric that we've seen in the past where I think it didn't really serve anybody, but just indeed, I think, made these two adversaries even that much more, I think, polarized rather than talking about kind of figuring a way to move forward and find aligned interests to, in fact, diffuse the tension rather than escalate it.
Genevieve, let's take a look now at this relationship and what impact it might have on the region as a whole. People will be forgiven if they forget that the United States and Iran, once upon a time, were actually pretty close allies. But help us understand now, what is the benefit to having an alliance with Iran rather than one with Saudi Arabia and or Egypt as far as the United States is concerned?
Well, it's not an either-or situation, but as you point out, if things continue moving forward, it will completely change the political dynamics in the Middle East. And this is why you have the Saudis being so alarmed now. You have some Gulf states alarmed, even though it's been very interesting to watch this week the Iranians' outreach to Gulf states, to Kuwait, to other states in the region. But I was actually just in the Middle East, in Lebanon and Egypt last week and over the last few weeks. And there is great concern, not only on the state level, but on the societal level among Sunni populations and Sunni societies that Iran, the hegemon, again, will rise up and try to assert itself in Sunni-dominated countries. And so I think that as we have seen the escalation of sectarianism as a result, and I'm talking about Shia-Sunni sectarianism, as a result of the war in Syria, as a result of the conflict in Iraq, Iran now is playing, is a factor in the escalation of this sectarianism, at least as it is perceived on the ground. And I'll just give you a small example. I was in the Tripoli area in northern Lebanon in late November, and there is great concern that this is going to basically allow the status quo in Syria to remain. So you have a lot of Sunni Islamists in northern Lebanon, some of whom go back and forth across the border, fighting against Assad, and they're really alarmed by this agreement. They really believe that this is going to tip the balance in favor of the Shia. So not only in favor of Iran, but in favor of Shia interests in the region. And so I think that, as I said, if things go forward, we're going to see, I wouldn't be so dramatic as to call it a realignment, but I think that we're going to see the Saudis perhaps trying to become less dependent upon the United States, if that's possible, because they feel that the United States is sort of betraying them, turning Washington's back on Riyadh with this new rapprochement with Iran, if that's what it turns out to be. So we have to remember that in many conflicts in the Middle East now, there is this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We see this in Lebanon, we see this in Yemen, we see this in Saudi Arabia.
Let me jump in here because we're down to our last few minutes here, and I want to get Besma on this issue as well. Is it too naive to think that the United States could potentially be on good terms with Shia countries and good terms with Sunni countries at the same time?
I don't think that's naive at all. In fact, unfortunately, so much of the Middle East is kind of always coded in these binary terms, but it doesn't need to be. In fact, if you look at the alliance structures throughout the region, it's really quite complex, and too often it's been put in these kind of binary terms for simplicity's sake, but I think it's much too, detailed and nuanced to really just give it that coat. In the case of the Americans, I think that they have an interest in seeing, not this usual pattern of militarizing the region, to try and diffuse things, to talk things through, whether it's because of their pivot to Asia, whether it's because they realize that the military is a huge drain on their fiscal situation. They can't afford to really continue to be the most militarized country in the world. It needs to kind of use other tools in its toolbox to really get at the kinds of long-term strategic goals it wants to achieve. So I think it's recognizing that now, and really this is just part of, a different strategy in the Middle East, and I think it's a good one, because ultimately at the end of the day, more talk is better than the alternative, which no one wants to see, and that's more militarized action.
Well, let's talk about the one country, Besma, that we haven't referred to so far, and that's Israel. The initial reaction out of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, was this deal is terrible, we can't stand it, we won't live by it, we can't live by it. He then, a few days later, said, I'm prepared to meet with the new Iranian president if that might help things. Where do you think Israel is on this now?
Well, I think that was Peres that actually said that he would be willing to meet with Rouhani, which is quite different than Netanyahu. I think, Netanyahu really will accept nothing. There's no deal that would appease Netanyahu, and particularly, I think, the right-wing part of that party. At the end of the day, Netanyahu and the Israeli government is basically banking on that they are the defenders, that particular party, and Netanyahu himself, that they are the defenders of Israel. And so there is no deal that I think that they would accept, and that's really important because that's just not realistic. It's not plausible, it's not realistic. No Iranian is going to agree to 0% enrichment. So I think that really the Israelis have to come to recognition that 5%, bringing this down to a civilian nuclear program, is realistic. They need to increase monitoring, and that's what the terms of, or at least what we've seen in the interim deal, is going to do. And that's a good thing for the long-term stability of the region. But to expect, somehow we're going to go down to 0% and 19,000 centrifuges are going to disappear, it's just, I think, it's just pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. So it's I think, a reality check that needs to be taken to the Israelis.
And just in our last few seconds, do the Israelis marginalize themselves as a player in any of this by continuing to hold that position, in your view?
Well, no, in one ways, they enjoy playing this bad cop position. Really, on the international scale, them, and perhaps you can include that the Canadian government, but more importantly, even U.S. Congress, particularly the right-wing element of the U.S. Congress, have made this really interesting trifecta of being the ones that oppose anything, any kind of deal. So they really want to play this bad cop role in the negotiations. Perhaps they think by doing that, it'll keep the Iranians on their toes. They won't, have this soft approach to actually meeting the conditions of the deal. I think at the end of the day, that's not going to change. That position is not going to change. But truth of the matter is, if we're really getting technical and looking at what's feasible and politically capable of being done, it's not going to happen to get to 0% enrichment. And I'm afraid we're going to keep seeing that kind of negative rhetoric out of the Israelis, out of the Canadian government, out of U.S. Congress until the very last day. They're just not going to accept anything.
Okay, I'm afraid that's our time. Genevieve Abdo in Washington, D.C., thanks for joining us. On the line from the American Capitol, Besma Momani from CG in Waterloo, thank you for joining us here in Toronto.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.